The gift of unexpected grace. Sarah Martinez clutched her boarding pass tightly, her heart racing with excitement and nerves as she stood in the chaotic departure lounge of Denver International Airport. After months of saving every penny from her job as a pediatric nurse, she had finally scraped together enough money for a flight to San Francisco to attend her younger sister's wedding, the first time she'd been able to afford a plane ticket in over 3 years. The boarding pass represented far more than just a ticket. It was the culmination of countless sacrifices, skipped meals, extra shifts, and the careful hoarding of every dollar she could spare from her modest salary. Maria, her younger sister, had been her closest confidant since childhood, and Sarah had promised to be her maid of honor, a role that meant everything to both of them after growing up in a single-parent household where they had learned to rely on each other for everything. The gate area buzzed with the usual airport energy. Business travelers typing furiously on laptops, families corralling restless children, elderly couples consulting boarding passes with nervous excitement, and the constant hum of announcements echoing through the terminal in multiple languages. Sarah checked her watch nervously, knowing this was cutting it close, but she had worked a double shift at the hospital the night before, staying late to comfort a young patient who had been admitted with severe pneumonia, and barely made it to the airport in time after racing through downtown traffic in her aging Honda Civic. Her scrubs were still in her bag, along with a carefully pressed bridesmaid dress that had cost her a week's worth of grocery money, and she could still smell the faint scent of hospital antiseptic on her hands despite having washed them thoroughly before leaving. As she glanced around the crowded waiting area, mentally rehearsing her maid of honor speech and wondering if she had remembered to pack her sister's favorite pearl earrings that she had promised to bring, her attention was drawn to a commotion near the check-in counter where a tall man in an expensive but wrinkled suit was struggling to manage what appeared to be an increasingly difficult situation. He held a small girl, perhaps 4 years old, who was crying softly against his shoulder, her tiny arms wrapped around his neck while he juggled a phone pressed to his ear, a briefcase that looked like it had been hastily packed, and what looked like important legal documents scattered across the counter in disorganized piles. The man's face was etched with exhaustion and barely contained frustration as he spoke in hushed, urgent tones to someone on the other end of the line, his free hand running through his disheveled hair while trying to keep the little girl's blanket from falling to the floor. Sarah watched as he tried to calm the little girl while simultaneously attempting to resolve whatever crisis was unfolding through his phone conversation, and she could see the defeat beginning to creep into his posture as his shoulders sagged with each passing minute. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who was clearly doing her best to help, looked sympathetic but helpless as she explained that due to overbooking caused by weather delays from the previous day, several passengers would need to wait for the next flight, and despite his obvious distress and repeated explanations about the urgency of his situation, the man's name was on the standby list with no guarantee of boarding. Sarah heard fragments of his conversation, something about a custody hearing, a delayed flight from Chicago where he had been attending his father's funeral, and the desperate need to reach San Francisco before the family court closed at 5 o'clock that afternoon. The legal documents on the counter appeared to be custody papers, and Sarah caught glimpses of official letterhead and court seals that spoke to the gravity of his situation. The little girl, sensing her father's stress and picking up on the tension in his voice, began to cry harder, her small body shaking with sobs as she clung to him desperately, and Sarah felt her heart break watching this man who was clearly doing his best in an impossible situation while trying to maintain his composure for his daughter's sake. Without thinking, driven by an instinct that had guided her through countless difficult moments in her nursing career where she had learned to recognize when someone needed help more than she needed whatever she was holding on to, Sarah approached the counter with determined steps. She had seen this look before, the desperate exhaustion of a parent who had reached the end of their rope, the kind of helplessness that came when bureaucracy and circumstance conspired against someone who was already fighting an uphill battle. "Excuse me," she said softly to the gate agent, her voice barely audible above the terminal noise but carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. "I'd like to give my seat to this gentleman and his daughter." The man looked up, surprised, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and worry, clearly not understanding what he had just heard. "Miss, you don't understand," he began, his voice hoarse from stress and the phone conversation, but Sarah held up her hand gently, the same gesture she used to calm anxious parents in the pediatric ward. I can take a later flight, she said, managing a warm smile despite the knot forming in her stomach as she realized what this meant for her sister's wedding, the carefully planned schedule, the bridesmaid dress hanging in her hotel room, and the speech she had memorized about growing up together through hardship. Your little girl needs to get home, and you look like you've been through enough today. The gate agent looked between them uncertainly, her fingers hovering over her keyboard as she processed this unusual request, but Sarah was already sliding her boarding pass across the counter with steady hands. Please, just make sure they get on this flight, she said, her voice gaining strength even as she felt her own plans dissolving. I'll figure out another way. The man stared at her in disbelief, bouncing the little girl gently as her sobs began to subside, and she lifted her tear-streaked face to look at this stranger who had somehow changed the energy around them. I can't accept this, he said, his voice thick with emotion and disbelief. You don't know what this means, but I can't let a stranger sacrifice something this important. Sarah interrupted him with a gentle touch on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles and recognizing the signs of someone who had been carrying an impossible weight for too long. I'm a pediatric nurse, she said, looking at the tired little girl with professional concern, noting the way the child's breathing had calmed slightly and how she was beginning to show curiosity about her surroundings. I can see she needs to get where she's going, and honestly, helping people is what I do. It's who I am. She paused, looking directly into his eyes with the kind of steady gaze that had comforted countless worried parents. Besides, my sister will understand. She's the one who taught me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is show up for people who need us. The man's eyes filled with tears as he looked at this young woman who had just handed him a miracle without knowing anything about him or his circumstances, without asking for his story or demanding explanations. What's your name? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell of this unexpected kindness. Sarah Martinez, she replied, then knelt down to be at eye level with the little girl, her nursing instincts automatically taking over as she assessed the child's emotional state. And what's your name, sweetheart? The child peeked out from her father's shoulder and whispered, Emma, her voice small but curious. Sarah smiled warmly, the same smile she used with her young patients, genuine and reassuring. That's a beautiful name, Emma. You and your daddy are going to be just fine. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small stuffed elephant, one of several she always carried for emergencies at the hospital. Would you like to hold Mr. Peanuts for the airplane ride? He's very good at flying. Emma's eyes widened with wonder as she accepted the gift, clutching it close to her chest. As they boarded the plane, the man, who had introduced himself simply as Michael, turned back one last time to look at Sarah sitting alone in the departure lounge, her own dreams temporarily set aside for strangers she'd never see again, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with guilt that would stay with him for weeks to come. 3 weeks later, Sarah was working her usual shift at Children's Hospital when she received a call asking her to come to the administrative office. Confused and slightly worried, wondering if she had made some mistake or if there was an issue with her performance reviews, she made her way upstairs where she found a woman in an expensive suit waiting for her with a manila envelope and a warm smile. Miss Martinez, the woman said, extending her hand professionally, I represent the Collins Foundation. We've been asked to deliver this to you personally. Inside the envelope was a letter written in careful handwriting on expensive letterhead. Dear Sarah, 3 weeks ago, you gave my daughter and me more than just a seat on an airplane, you gave us hope when we had none left. I was flying to San Francisco for an emergency custody hearing for Emma, my daughter, after my ex-wife had threatened to take her away permanently and move across the country where I would rarely see her. Because of your kindness, we made it in time, and I was able to prove that Emma belongs with me, that despite my demanding career, I am the parent who can provide her with the stability and love she needs. I later learned that you missed your sister's wedding because of your generosity, and that knowledge has haunted me every day since. I've spoken to Maria, your sister, and she told me about the sacrifices you've made throughout your life to help others, how you put yourself through nursing school while caring for your sick mother, how you've never taken a real vacation because you're always helping someone else. She also told me about your dream to specialize in pediatric oncology, and how you've been unable to